So in the book, I go on a journey through the brain, starting at the brainstem and ending at the frontal pole, the very other end of the brain, the most distinctively human part of the brain, the frontal pole. And that can do a really remarkable thing, which is to think about our own thinking. You can introspect, you can self-reflect, you can think about your own thinking, right? And I think one of the key things is, and by the way, this is something we can all enhance in ourselves. That self-reflection, that thinking about our own thinking, that's central to wisdom. And that wisdom is seeing the bigger picture about ourselves in the world so we can make wiser choices, right? That help us achieve our goals.
Woo, welcome. You have now entered Mad Warfare, mutually assured distraction, where we explore the weird, terrifying, and sometimes hilarious ways war is fought today, and how we can all protect our minds before we go too mad to find them.
Oh my!
Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern.
How can you talk if you haven't got a brain?
Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern.
Reminder, the opinions on this show are ours alone, and honestly, we might regret some of them later. They don't reflect our employers, past, present, or imaginary. This is a playground of wild ideas, so please, don't take anything here too seriously, unless it's genius. Then it was definitely intentional. Are humans destined to fight? Will we ever escape warfare, or is this an inescapable part of our wiring? That's what we're exploring today on MAD. I'm Jocelyn Brady.
I'm Sean Anthony Guillory.
Our guest today argues that whether you like it or not, our brains were built for conflict. He's a leading neuroscientist and advisor to the Pentagon, and his book Warhead, How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain, just hit shelves in October. Pick up your copy,
Look
kids.
at that.
He's here to talk about how conflict rewires our brains, how our brains drive conflict, and what that means for the future of war, democracy, I don't know, maybe all of civilization. No big deal. Please welcome Dr. Nicholas Wright.
Jocelyn and Sean, thank you very much for having me on.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Ours.
So you have been a doctor, a neuroscientist, an advisor to the Pentagon. Do you ever just take a nap?
I do. I just flew back from Washington a few days ago, so I'm quite tired as we speak. So immediately after this show, I will be taking a nap. But don't worry, I've taken lots of coffee for now.
What is the common thread tying all of your work together? How did you go from neuroscience to conflict and war, for example?
Yeah, I guess it's always been sort of two major things have always been science and then applying that in the real world. And I've always wanted to, try and make the world a better place. And, that's what you do as a doctor. And I think also that's what people do in national security as well. I spent a number of years, as you said, so I was a doctor, a neurology doctor in London, in Oxford, and I, treated patients, was involved in surgery, brain surgery and all sorts of things. And then I spent a number of years using functional brain imaging. So that's brain scanning and different computational techniques, so computer analysis, to look at how humans make decisions. So about things like rewards and punishments and fear and things like that, social decision making, social motivations. And so I did that all in the lab that DeepMind was spun out of. And so I've been closely linked with AI and those sort of technological frontiers. But what I really wanted to do was to apply it.
Yeah.
It's Google DeepMind after Google bought them. But to begin with, they were just DeepMind, just cool. Plain old DeepMind.
Very cool.
And so, Demis and I briefly had offices. We had desks in the same office for a while.
Wow.
Demis Hassabis before he went on to found DeepMind and then win his Nobel Prize and so on. And so, but I was wanting to apply this finding to the real world. And so I then went to Washington, DC, and I really wanted to apply what we were learning. There's a real hubbub of ideas. That's why DeepMind spun out of the lab. It's a real hubbub of new ideas about how the brain works, how we work as human beings. And I want to apply that to thinking that was really important. And there's no more important topic than, for example, decision making in nuclear weapons. And that really centers on how individual humans think. Right? It's about trying to influence decision-making of key people like Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping. That's what the people at US Stratcom, the people who have to think about these nuclear weapons strategies, that's what they have to think about. And so I spent a number of years then working on nuclear strategy and human machine teams and so on, and worked with, and I've been working for over a decade now, advising people in the Pentagon Joint Staff. And the reason why this book came out now is because, you guys are well versed in national security, but the majority of people in the general public, they don't understand that the world has changed, and that, I start the book with a true story about, being with a friend in a cozy pub in North London. And my friend, who's a very clever guy, is a psychiatry professor. And he was like, "What are you working on?" I was like, "I'm writing a book about war in the brain." And he was like, "Oh, there's not going to be a war. And if there is a war, don't worry about it, because, America's got so many guns and planes and tanks and whatever, it'll be fine, be totally fine." But I knew from working with the Pentagon that that wasn't the case. That if there were a major war between the US and China, the US could lose. Certainly if that war became a prolonged war. And so I really wanted to, bring this knowledge that I've been lucky enough to gain through working in wonderful labs, learning about the brain, and also then working with the Pentagon now for over 10 years, and bring this knowledge about how war can be understood, how we can get better self-knowledge of ourselves as humans, so that we can stop wars escalating if we can, and if we must fight a war, that we can win. And I want to bring that knowledge to a broader audience. And so what I'm arguing for really in the book, if there's a bumper sticker, it would be peace through self-knowledge. I really believe we can build, I'm optimistic, and I believe we can build a better world. I believe we can build a safer world, a more peaceful world, if we use the self-knowledge we've gained about ourselves as humans through neuroscience and other intellectual activities.
I just want to point out, for those who aren't watching, Sean was giving the snaps to that.
It was
Peace
like
through
a
self-knowledge.
snapping chef's kiss, because I would say, coming from neuroscience and figuring out how I could be helpful in national security, there were like two things that really kind of inspired me. First was the psychology of intelligence analysis by Richard Spoyer. That was just a paradigm shift for me, coming from data science at the time into seeing like, oh, okay, like you can use that kind of scrutiny on yourself as an analyst. And I was like, I come from cognitive psychology. How did I not know that? And then like, okay, what else is in the field? And it was coming across again, like your work, Nick, in terms of the Joint Chiefs stuff, the stuff that was out there and published. What kind of inspired you to do this book is a lot of the same reason that inspired us to do this show, to kind of help folks see this. Let me spin the book. Let's see if I can do this. Watch me. It's a little more than just warheads on foreheads. So try wrapping the book in that.
Speaking of peace, I'm sure we all know people who, can't we all just get along? Just the people who are like, I don't like war. I don't think we should ever have war. Why can't people just be peaceful? Why can't we just practice peace? And you pointed out in your book that a lot of well-intentioned thinkers, really, really incredibly intelligent people, have suggested that the arc of humanity trends towards peace, and that can't we just encourage more of that? And your point is basically, if I'm summarizing right, while that's not inaccurate to say we have overall trended toward more getting along a little better, it's an incomplete picture and maybe to our detriment. Can you go into more detail on that?
No, you're exactly correct. I think that, there are lots of people who are very clever and who write wonderful books. So if you look at the two biggest books on the brain and war, essentially, over the last 15, 20 years, and that's by Steven Pinker, and then who's at Harvard, and then a chap called Robert Sapolsky, who's at Stanford. And they're both great books, very intelligent guys, very clever guys. But I would say that their ideas are not so much wrong as dangerously incomplete, not just incomplete, but dangerously incomplete. So you look at Steven Pinker, for example, and I think he is right. Yeah, as you said, so Steven Pinker's idea is essentially that societies, within societies and between societies, we're becoming more peaceful on the whole. And I think he's right that we probably are. That is where the arc of history is tending towards. But the problem is that people made exactly the same types of arguments in 1914, after 99 years without a general European war, a general war between all the great powers. And then we had the cataclysm of World War I, right? Equally passionately and cleverly argued books made the same point then. So, I think Steven Pinker's thesis is right, but that doesn't help us, because wars do break out, and we need to think how we can use the brain to fight and win those wars if we must. Because there will always be there's not one reason why we are driven towards war. There are many reasons, right? Our brain is like an orchestra. There are many different systems in the brain, and that brain's orchestra gives us a symphony within which we live our everyday lives, in which we also fight wars. And there's not one simple reason that drives us towards war. There are many reasons. So, for example, down lower in the brain, we need fear, right? Fear is useful. It sounds counterintuitive, but fear is useful. We need fear. So if you lose those parts of the brain, and there are very rare patients who lose the part of the brain called the amygdala that's really important for fear. And in some of those patients, they lose the ability to see fear in others and to feel fear themselves. And those people don't become fearless criminals who can take whatever they want without, worrying about any consequences. They actually become victims of crime. So we need fear. Fear is useful, but fear can drive us towards war because it leads to spirals of fear between people, between humans. And that's, that can drive us towards war. Injustice can powerfully motivate us to stand up for those weaker than ourselves in society, or do the right thing, or make the world a better place. And, that desire to work against injustice. But when two groups of people both have too exclusive a sense of injustice, right, against one another, then that can itself lead to conflict, a tragedy, not of right versus wrong, but of right versus right. And you see that playing out to some extent in places like Israel-Palestine. The whole of our brains, there are misunderstandings due to the fog of war. For all those reasons, we can be driven to war, and we need to be able to use the central weapon of war, which is our brain, to win a war if we must. And just one last point would be the Robert Sapolsky of "Can everyone be nicer, Jocelyn?" Because that was your original point. Yes, again, he's not wrong, right? Reconciliation is every single bit as human as conflict. We are incredibly good at reconciling with others, humans. We have remarkable abilities to reconcile and cooperate. And yes, that is every bit as much of who we are as conflict. Winston Churchill, in the beginning of his book, right at the front of his book on the history of World War II, right, he has "In victory, magnanimity." Right, reconciliation is really there, but that cannot just. We were never going to have defeated Hitler simply by being nicer to him. That was never going to happen. We were never going to have stopped World War II by simply just being nicer to Adolf Hitler, because Adolf Hitler really wanted to invade lots of other countries. That he'd written a whole book about it. I think that all of these ideas are partially true, but I think we need to step back and see the bigger picture, think about our own thinking, and that's something that our human brains are particularly good at. And that's one of the reasons why I'm optimistic. So I think we're really good at it, and I think we can do it better.
Excellent. You mentioned war a couple of times. The kind of definition we've been going on, at least since the first episode, has been an antagonistic political struggle in terms of like two different kind of parties, political in terms of at least the grouping, and then like a struggle where it's still to be decided who is won or not. So that's at least kind of like our Twitter length definition of how we're defining war. But feel free to grade that, or if you had an idea like when you're talking about war, I'd love for you to share that.
I mean, there are literally libraries of books on what is and isn't war. I think that my definition that I have in the book, and that I obviously agree with, because I literally wrote it in the book, is pretty consistent with yours. So, I mean, I would define war as politically motivated violence at scale between human groups.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think that's very similar to your definition. So I think that it's not just violence between groups. It has to be at scale. So war is not just a bar fight. So I think that's what war is. There also has to be violence. I think that, if there's no violence, then or at least you might declare war on somebody and then a war has started. Mm. But I mean, there has to be violence involved, physical violence in some way. So I think all of those things are very, I'd say I basically agree with you. And I think you're obviously, also we all live within, those who've gone before us. We learn. So as humans, we have to take ideas from those who come before us. Mm. We're literally speaking in English. I didn't invent the English language, and neither did you. I don't know. Maybe you did. I don't know now. But we live with von Clausewitz. We live with Sun Tzu. All of these people, Sun Tzu, depending on how to pronounce it. All of these different people who've influenced our thinking about war. And I think your idea is a broadly good one. And there will always be, definitional arguments or arguments at the edge of definitions, but I liked it.
Jocelyn, he likes it.
We're going to put it on our website.
I'm so excited. Yeah, we'll take that as a testimonial.
Nick likes it. In your book, you talk about we're wired for conflict. Is this why we love bad reality TV? And are we doomed?
I mean, why do we love bad reality TV? That's a good question. So obviously I have to link it to war because now you've put me in the frame of mind of linking everything to war.
Love at
But,
war, go.
Why? Yeah, I mean, but it's partly, I mean, think about, so for example, a lot of people say, oh, Donald Trump is very hard to understand, right? He likes things that he likes, attractive mates or potential mates. He likes his own family. He likes being powerful. These are all pretty basic things. He's a brilliant communicator. There are lots of other things. I'm not getting involved in a political discussion at the moment, but I'm just saying these are all, you talk about Love Island. Why do we care about Love Island? We care about Love Island because, there is almost nothing more basic for human beings. We have two main goals, right? So why do you have a brain? So why are you Jocelyn? Why do you Sean? Why do you have brains? Why do I have a brain? Why does every listener out there, every viewer out there have a brain? The reason why you have a brain is to link senses coming in and link those to actions that help you better achieve your goals. Right, that's why you have a brain. That's why a fruit fly has a brain. That's why a worm has a brain. That's why a sparrow has a brain, or a chimpanzee has a brain, or you have a brain, or I have a brain. That's what our brain is for. Linking senses to actions, and those actions that can help us achieve our goals. And the two most basic goals are maintaining our bodily order, right? So food, water, and so on, and sexual reproduction.
Yeah.
Right, and reproduction. If we didn't have that as a major goal, then, there wouldn't be an unbroken chain of reproduction from 3.8 billion years ago to literally the three of us sitting on this podcast. So you talk about why people love Love Island. Love Island is about sex and like attractive people chatting about stuff in bikinis. And another thing that we really like is gossip. So gossip is hugely valuable. So genuinely, it can be life-saving. Mm. So if you think about, we love gossip. We love those reality TV shows to see behind the curtains of things. So I have, and you have, and humans have incredibly sophisticated machinery for working out the intentions of others. Right? It's called theory of mind or mentalizing. So I have a beautiful model in my mind of people I've interacted with many times. And I've already developed a model of Sean, and I've already developed a model of you, Jocelyn, and you have a model of me in your mind. And that helps us cooperate together, and it helps us, for example, if we're playing doubles tennis, I could think, oh, you're suggesting you're going to do whatever, and I'll then run in a different direction. Or also, if I'm playing my opponent in tennis, I can say, are they going to play cross court or down the line? And we always have these wonderful models, and they can be really important for working out whether people are going to defect or cooperate with us. Are people trustworthy or not? And so gossip really matters, because then you really get an idea of what people are really like. What are people really thinking? What's really going on behind the scenes? And that's why we love gossip. Or not all of us, but like a lot of people love gossip and reality fusions, whatever, because we're getting an insight into how people really think. They really feel the reality of those people, or at least one dimension of those people. And it's trivia in Love Island, or it's trivia in The Hills or whatever, but that can often be life and death if you are in a dangerous environment.
I would think we also gain some insight on how that behavior is met with reward or punishment, right? So we're kind of learning about our own, not only how people are wired, but what would happen if we were like that. Mm-hmm. What are the consequences or benefits of behaving a certain way?
And that's one of the things
all of us would love. Yeah.
No, you're totally right. I mean, that's one of the things we can do. So one of the most amazing things that we can do in our brains, I think you used the word imagination earlier, and we can imagine things. And so, for example, this is what Demis Hassabis, the chap who won last year's Nobel Prize for AI. So what he did in his PhD was he looked at the hippocampal entorhinal region, which is a region that's very important for a variety of things like navigation and memory and so on. And it's important for memory, and it's important for imagining the future. So we have memories. So the purpose of memory is not to create some, dusty tome about the past. The reason why you have memories is to help you better navigate the future, to imagine possible futures and navigate through them better. And so imagination is just central to what we are as humans. And we can ask, what if? And so I can ask, for example, what would people, if I'm in a dangerous, in the military, I'm in a dangerous situation, what would happen if I were a coward here? What would happen if I didn't run forwards? What would happen if I hung back? What would happen if I did charge forwards? We can ask all these different what if questions and think about how that would pan out in terms of, physical harm potentially, success at achieving the mission, achieving our plan, and also in terms of managing our reputation amongst our peers. And if you're in a conflict, for example, your reputation amongst your peers will literally be life and death. So our ability to ask these what if questions, to simulate the world in our brains, that's really in there. We really do have that capability, and that is central to how we manage, our reputation. So that was I'm really pleased that no one's asked me on no podcast so far has anyone asked me about that. So that is brilliant. Thank you very much. I love that. I love that idea of simulating the future and asking what ifs.
Well, and speaking of what if and imagination, it feels like, just from my solitary brain locked in my skull perspective, that America right now, it is possibly suffering from a lack of imagination, or at least for many of us, it can feel like there's hopelessness, or there's too much division, or we're seeing many of the things that we want less of, but not so much talking about what we would like more of and what is a more ideal future. Curious if you have comments on that, or how we might be able to shift our perspective from less of this to more of that, and having a more, sparking that imagination in a more perhaps positive way.
That is a really great question. I mean, it's, as you suggest, I think, and you framed it very well. I think it's, one of the great questions of our age. And there are like many components of that are well explained by, how our brains work. So I think one of them is it's intergenerational. So there was a medieval Muslim scholar called Ibn Khaldun who described how empires were built and decayed in 3 generations. So the first generation are hungry and keen, and they build the empire. The second generation can see what their parents had built and can maintain the empire. And the third generation are palace-reared, palace-suckled princelings who don't have the grit to keep things going. And I think there is an element, and this is not criticism. I mean, why should those princelings? No, they didn't build, they weren't tough. They weren't it's nice. It's nice being in the palace. But I think that's basically to a reasonable degree where we are now. Objectively, by almost any objective measure, the society we live in now in Britain or in America or in Australia or France or whatever, by almost any objective measure, it's one of the best bits of history ever to live in the history of the world. And yet people are not, for them, it's the boring status quo. Right. And every new generation that comes along, they will always be bored by this boring new status quo. And I think that is a significant problem. That's just an intergenerational problem. So one of the things is for us to try and, realize, to see this fact about our brains, to have this self-knowledge, that one of the reasons why we feel that there is this, as you were saying, that there's too much of the bad stuff and none of the good stuff. Well, actually, there's an enormous amount of the good stuff. It just may not feel like that because for us it's the status quo, but actually it is the good stuff. And if it went, I mean, if America genuinely did decay into proper authoritarianism, or if America really did go into a civil war, I mean, that's like really the bad stuff, not, people spending too much time on TikTok. Although I don't agree with TikTok, but that's a different discussion. So I think that's partly it. And then I think that how can we get people to imagine things better? So in the book, I go on a journey through the brain, starting at the brainstem and ending at the frontal pole, the very other end of the brain, the most distinctively human part of the brain, the frontal pole. And that can do a really remarkable thing, which is to think about our own thinking. So you, Jocelyn, or you, Sean, or any listener at home, you can introspect, you can self-reflect, you can think about your own thinking, right? Oh, how certain was I? You make a decision and then, oh, how certain was I in that? Right? Or, why did I do that? Right? We can think about our own thinking. And I think one of the key things is, and by the way, this is something we can all enhance in ourselves. And that key thinking is about that self-reflection, that thinking about our own thinking, that's central to wisdom. And for a lot of people in society now, I think we need to stop chasing things that are, I'm not saying we'll need to be sitting on a desert island somewhere thinking philosophical thoughts, but we can be a bit wiser in our lives. And that wisdom is seeing the bigger picture about ourselves in the world so we can make wiser choices, right? That help us achieve our goals. And I think part of that is and that if we can enhance our wisdom, right, which we can do through a variety of means, like, for example, not spending too much time looking at TikTok and so on, that actually is a route to helping us deal with the type of challenges that you were describing, Jocelyn.
I can already see where Warhead, in terms of getting exactly that and helping folks get it so we can move on to that next stage, so more kind of broader. You were definitely, and your work was an integral part for the folks who were in defense and intel to get that first, like, getting it spot. So when I talk to them, they kind of already get it. Or if they didn't, I could point them to one of your earlier works to help them, like, oh, okay, I get it. And it's in a language that I get. I was curious versus when you were first starting to now, when you were having those conversations with folks at the Pentagon or whatnot, did they, like, immediately get exactly what you're talking about in terms of the brain and its relation to war, or did it kind of take some time?
I think,
yeah.
I have a huge amount of respect. I mean, I've met so many people over the years in the American military, flag officers and other officers and enlisted men and women, obviously. And I have a huge amount. I've met a huge number of people, that I have had a huge amount of respect for. And I would say that in some ways, when I first started, briefing people in the Pentagon and whatever, it was over 10 years ago, the world was actually a much simpler place. I mean, what was the Pentagon really worried about? It was broad. I mean, yes, in theory, there was, Russia and China and whatever. But in reality, the great bulk of it was
like Middle
terrorism,
Eastern,
counterinsurgency, right? And in many ways, I'm not saying America did a great job on that, and neither did Britain, because we didn't ultimately win in either Afghanistan or Iraq very well there. That was all a bit of a disaster. But that said, it was simpler. It was a simpler problem set than now, where we have to genuinely balance war. I mean, we are in a struggle against genuinely peer, in China, a genuine peer competitor that now produces more, manufactures more stuff than the next 4 or maybe even 9 countries in the world put together, right? It dominates things like drone manufacturing. In a protracted war, and wars between great powers often go on for years, China could well massively outproduce the US. It wouldn't be like World War II, where there were loads of Sherman tanks rolling off the line. It would be the opposite. We would be the ones who were outnumbered in terms of machines. So in a way, we're in a more complicated world than we were then. But that said, as I said, I've met so many wonderful American military officers who really reflect, who are interested. And so I'll give you an example. The very first military officer I briefed in person in the Pentagon, he was then the J39, which, if you're in military circles, that's
Information.
but for everyone else, that's like a random alphanumeric code. So he was the J39, and it was like just me and him and a couple of other people, a couple of his team, and he wanted to talk to me for an hour about deterrence. What motivates humans? What can we learn from neuroscience about how to deter others, how to increase the effectiveness of our signaling to others, how to create psychological impacts deliberately and not accidentally, and cause accidental second and third order effects. Right? What does it matter? He was really interested in the human brain. Right, and I spent an hour with him, and we had a really great discussion. He then, a couple of years later, went on to write the foreword for a book of mine when he was then a major general, acting major general.
Oh, wow.
And now he is the head of US EUCOM. He's a 4-star general. He's the head of US EUCOM. He's in charge of NATO, Alexis Grinkovich. And he's just an intelligent, reflective guy who thinks deeply and carefully and tries to bring in many different sources of information so that he can see the bigger picture and make better decisions. And it's people like him that give me a lot more optimism about the future. And I think there are lots of people like that in the US military.
Something Sean and I have talked about this recently is things that we're obsessed with that we wish people would learn more of. And one of mine is emotional literacy, emotional granularity. And so you're talking earlier about how we use our senses and how our brains are processing this and giving rise to emotions, how fear is important. And I just wish people would, I guess, pay more attention to that, give more respect and credence to this. And I'm curious if you're seeing more of that, or how we might encourage more of the population and businesses and leadership too to embrace more of this, like why self-knowledge is so important, and what kinds of things you would encourage people to do first in that respect.
I think you're absolutely right. I think there are, and just to say, you're not the first person to say something along those lines. I mean, Plato was, had his view of the, the chariot, human nature as a charioteer and two horses. Freud, ego, super ego, id, and so on. So I think you're absolutely right. People have always tried to think about how our brains have many different components, including, the passions, to use a more old-fashioned term. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think there are really two challenges right now in a lot of getting people to use these more effectively, to get better self-knowledge about these. So one of the challenges is that people see, we should be rational. So I was in a meeting at Johns Hopkins, actually, and lots of people were like, we need to be using our system 2 brain, and, only, essentially it was like, we don't want to be using emotions. But the thing is, we need emotions. Emotions are useful. Emotions aren't like second quality things. If you don't have emotions, you wouldn't survive in dangerous, uncertain environments. You need things like fear, but also anger, but also joy and happiness. Like, how do we get something nice has happened? We need emotions to give us those rapid, often rapid, but not always rapid, broad set of responses to stimuli, and that can be life-saving. So that's why I have the metaphor of the brain like an orchestra with many different brain systems. So I describe thinking about thinking, and that's a bit like the conductor of the orchestra, right? That can reflect and say, oh no, we need a bit more timpani or whatever. And then I think the emotions are like the brass, right? It's really important. Without that section of the orchestra, you don't get a Beethoven symphony, right? Yes, we need the lovely violins, but we also need the brass, and it's so important. It's vital to who we are. It's not a rubbish version of how humans make decisions. It's a core component of the orchestra with which we live our lives. So I think you're absolutely right, and I think we need to rethink how we, and maybe it's partly Plato's fault, because it shouldn't just be like a charioteer and 2 horses, right? Orchestra. There we go. Plato's wrong and I'm right. You always have to pick someone to say is wrong. So I'm going to pick Plato. That guy was rubbish.
Pick on Plato.
But the second thing, exactly. And then the second thing I'd say, though, is that some people take this too far. And I think that in our society, for example, now we have anxiety disorders in countries like America or Britain or Germany at much higher rates than in much poorer countries. And yes, there are always measurement issues and it's complicated. But I think in some ways, so identity is very important. And I think one of the things we're doing now, especially people are self-diagnosing things on TikTok and so on, and also through some of the ways that the healthcare system is operating, we are over-diagnosing a lot of these problems. So anxiety disorders are essentially fear run amok. That's essentially what they are. And I think we're over-diagnosing those. People then take those as part of their identity, and then that in itself causes psychological problems. So I think we also need to be careful we don't move too far down that route. And that is a real danger I think we have now in society. Certainly like in over-identifying. British society. Yeah. So I think we have both of those things. And I think that if we have a better knowledge of how our emotions really work, part of an orchestra, and actually most people are fine. And things like sadness, being sad, failing at things. I've failed at things. Everyone's failed at things. Everyone who succeeds at things also fails at things. Members of my family have died. I mean, I'm not belittling that in any way. Everyone is sad. Mm-hmm. That's part of life. If you don't love anybody, you won't be sad when they die. But so I think we need to get that also into a bit more perspective. And I think both of those things, and hopefully we can see the slightly bigger picture about where our emotions fit within ourselves as humans. And then we can have a slightly more robust and resilient path forwards.
With the aspect of the self-diagnosing, let's talk a little in terms of, I'll say future issues, but some of them are like right now kind of issues as well, where some of that self-diagnosing is because now like
on TikTok especially,
you bring up in terms of social media, just the vastness in terms of information space, and then still shout out to Dennis in terms of the AI kind of stuff. But yeah. I just wanted to, in terms of those sort of, I want to say newer, but let's just say they are kind of like elements and how they play into war in our brain and the war against our brain. Just wanted to hear if you had any thoughts on that.
There is usually a limit to how effective information operations were. So ever can be. So if you look at, Britain during World War II was very effective at information operations against Germany. Germany was very effective in some aspects of information operations, for example, against France in the Battle of France. But it wasn't decisive. And so I think we shouldn't overplay the importance of information operations. Just as, for example, better and faster aircraft are important, but it's unlikely that's going to be decisive. Right. There are many things that are important, but that doesn't make them decisive. And so I think information operations are important, but they're not, they're not going to be decisive usually. Now, how is AI going to play into that? So, or into information operations? There are many different ways, but I think let's just take a couple. So the first thing is going to be, I think you're absolutely right, we will see mass personalization of information operations, which is very effective and it will sway a proportion of people within society. And it could sow discord, or it could actively promote some kind of point of view. If there was a prolonged war, we would definitely see these things. And they'll be coming online in the next few years, just because it's a dual use technology. This is very useful for advertising. So, why won't it be developed for war? And another way that is slightly different that I think would also be really interesting, and this is somewhere where I can see AI making a big difference in the near future, is that if you want to test out information operations at the moment, you want to test out different things, test out different types of messages or campaigns, it's very difficult to do that without actually doing experiments in the real world. But I think that very soon, and by very soon I mean basically pretty much now, we're seeing amazing, using generative AI, we can now actually build for the first time really good test ranges for testing out information operations using AI, which is something you just couldn't really do even 5 years ago. And I think you are going to start being able to do that now. And that will make these information operations, obviously you can generate a huge amount of content for an information operation much more quickly now than you could in the past. But I think you can also test these out in simulated environments now, which simply didn't exist very well not that long ago. So I think we're going to get much more effective information operations. But again, they're probably not going to be decisive, but that doesn't mean they're not very useful. And, in the West, we need to be building these things so that we can defend against adversaries and push back as we need to. But of course, very powerful tools, and we don't want them to be turned internally because it's absolutely critical. It's like, the US national security establishment is enormously powerful, and it must not be turned internally because that is extremely dangerous. And the same with Britain.
No creating say war within. And so to talk about AI too, with, we've seen a lot of problems with it recently, particularly with teenagers and, contributing to suicide and really horrendous things when people are identifying too much with the AI and persuaded by it. But can it be used in some way to increase our self-knowledge? Have you seen applications of that where it can help us check ourselves and educate further?
Yes. And just to say, it's like the telephone. The idea, if you told me that I could have carried around a computer that meant I could access the equivalent of, when I was a kid, I could access the equivalent of the Encyclopedia Britannica or whatever the thing would be from my pocket, wherever I was, I'd be like, wow, I'm going to know so much stuff. It's going to be amazing. Yeah. But of course, most people use their smartphone to look up random nonsense. So, we could use it, but in theory, we could look up, quantum physics on the bus on the way to work, or we could alternatively look up random nonsense. So it could be used for either thing. And I think it's going to be the same with these new technologies with AI. So yes. So for example, IARPA, which is DARPA are the people who invented the internet, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And IARPA is the intelligence equivalent of that. And they ran a program which was about developing tools that would help analysts that would interrogate analysts' work to check the logical consistency of the work, to provide them with useful information and alternative sources of information they might not have thought of, like a slightly contrarian bit of grit that can, in the shell that can give you the pearl, and I think, yes, we are going to be developing these technologies that will help us think. And in many ways, that's replicating what we get from a colleague or a mentor or peer review in an academic journal, only now it will be semi-automated. So when I wrote my book, I sent it off to lots of experts. I sent it off to neuroscience experts. I sent it off to people who have served, on the front lines in the military, people who are intelligence officers, all sorts, historians, all sorts of different experts. And probably before I did that, it would have been good if I'd been able to, and just normal members of the public who were friends of mine. But probably would have been good before doing that if I could have had a machine that could have given me a first pass. Reading it all and critiquing it and telling me, and I'm not saying that would give me everything I needed, and I still would have wanted all the different human perspectives, but maybe that would have been a good first pass, and that would have been really useful. I would be very surprised if that isn't in some iteration of Word or Microsoft Office at some point in the not distant future.
The Google Docs asks me if I want it to be summarized, but I don't know if I can do more than that.
Well, that's what we have now, but maybe that's the thing in the future, if it could critique the logical progression of your piece, if it could, give you some useful, interesting feedback, a slightly different perspective. So that's why, for example, I think, so if we want to enhance the way we think about our own thinking, this metacognition, thinking about our own thinking, what the frontal pole does so well, one way of doing that is to get other people to critique our work, or to explain our work to others so they can then critique it, or to think about our own work from a third person perspective. Or, to get one of these computers to do it. In the last chapter of the book, for example, I look at the last 25, 30 years of history, not from the point of view, because I'm British, you're American, not from the point of view we know so well, but to think from the point of view of China, Chinese people. So, for example, 9/11 was a huge deal. I'm sure you both remember where you were when you heard about 9/11. I can remember I was in a GP surgery in North London as a medical student, and we were in a seminar room. I can vividly remember that. Yeah. But the thing is it was just much less of a big deal in China. And that's not because they were nasty people or they were mean or whatever. It's just, imagine if the exact equivalent had happened in China. It would have been a big deal, but it wouldn't have been as big an event as it was for us in the West. So I think, sometimes taking a different perspective, taking a Chinese or Russian perspective on world history, it doesn't mean you have to agree with everything, but just sometimes taking a different perspective in and of itself can be really valuable. And hopefully AI will help us do that kind of thing better. Or we could just spend the whole time looking at cat pictures or whatever, everyone always says about the internet.
Get my cat perspective. I do that all. My cat is right here on my lap, by the way. So hello.
Oh, wow.
Never
Oh, my
too
God, it's true. It's true. Is that a generative AI cat? Now, next time you pick it up, it will be a dog. And then the next time it will be half cat, half dog. Yeah. This is good stuff. I like this. It's sophisticated. Yeah.
Yes, we're bringing them together. Dogs and cats. Finally.
Very nice.
I had a question about leadership. Earlier you were mentioning leaders. What did I want to ask? It was along the lines of, admitting failure. I feel perhaps the leaders we have could be more open about failing and what they've learned from it. And it seems like there's more of a push toward hubris overall, or we're not seeing good examples of that. And if self-knowledge and part of that being learning from failure is part of how we can, die less in war and get along a little more, how do we encourage more of that?
That is a good question. People often criticize leaders, but I think, to some extent we get the leaders we deserve. And in the public, we're like, we want leaders to admit they're wrong and admit they're human and fallible or whatever. And then they're like, you made a mistake. And we click on the thing, we go, what's he made a complete idiot of themselves eating a bacon sandwich or whatever. I don't know what the thing would be. So I think, we have to take some responsibility ourselves as concerned citizens, that we have some responsibility in, not looking negatively when somebody admits they made a mistake or they've changed their mind. And as you say, great leaders do change their mind. So Winston Churchill famously changed his mind. In fact, for some historians, notoriously changed his mind about a variety of things. But he was willing, the whole point was he was willing to be argued out of positions that he took, which is why he chose people who would challenge his assumptions and challenge his points of view. How can we get people to admit things more? Again, I would say, to some extent, it's like who we choose as our leaders. I don't know American politics well enough, so to go, I can say John McCain. But John McCain seems like the kind of guy who would have admitted he was wrong about things every now and again, at least.
I agree.
Barack Obama seems at least like he would have come up with an extremely clever reason why it was fine for him to have chosen what he did at the time, because he was a very smart guy. He was a lawyer. So he would have come up with a very lawyerly argument about why he was correct to make the decision at the time, but it turned out to be wrong with the benefit of hindsight. But then, for example, he never said that as a foreign understanding, he never thought that refusing to take military action against Syria with the use of chemical weapons was used. And yet I think most people would now see that as a mistake. But I'd say he was probably somebody who did more, would have admitted it more. Hopefully people like now General Grinkovich, the four-star who's in charge of EUCOM, who I met, because he's learned from lots of people, not just me, obviously, I'm not saying it's for me, but lots of different people. Hopefully he's learned many different things. And a lot of this will take decades to come through. Even Barack Obama, who's one of the youngest presidents in the, for some very considerable time, he was decades through his life before he became president. So I'd say actually a lot of the onus is on us as concerned citizens and on people coming up who can try to learn more about how they really work. So to understand that it will make me a better decision maker if I can learn from my mistakes. But inevitably in the hard hoi polloi of politics, that's going to be extremely difficult. And like, why should they do that if we're going to penalise them for it?
I say we need to show them the ROI.
And the other thing to say is that type of thing is. Do you remember, it was Mitt Romney, wasn't it, who said, like, I was in favour of that policy before I was against it, and that hasn't stuck in my head, and I'm not even an American. Didn't he say something famously along those lines? I was pro that policy before I was against it, or something. And then I think that we can give people that they need to have the idea that they could succeed in politics after having changed their minds. And that will just take years. That will also take years to change. So that's to some extent a cultural issue as well. And culture takes years to change. So, for example, when people say now, well, how can we make America a less polarized society? And it's something that I've been, thought about quite a bit, particularly from the point of view of more general about how societies decay and turn to violence and so on. And it is going to take years. So, for example, in a much more extreme case, in 1945, Germany had demonstrably lost World War II. It had been a catastrophe. The Germans had lost. And yet, even though demonstrably they'd lost and it had been a calamity, for years afterwards, all the way through consistently up to 1949, so, half a decade later, a majority of Germans consistently thought Nazism had been a good idea badly applied. Even by 1952, 25% of Germans had a favourable opinion of Hitler. And clearly things hadn't panned out very well with the Hitlerite policies. Even if you're like pro-German militarism, that didn't pan out very well. So it takes a really long time to change people, and it will take understanding ourselves and our brains and how it works and how culture and identity work in our brains. That's changing society, changing to get a more self-critical or change of mind or getting things wrong and owning it up type of culture. That is probably going to take years, realistically, for that to feed through, even if we started tomorrow. So we just need to, it's not something we can solve overnight. It's going to take a long time. But then that's why it's so important that people like you and Jocelyn and Sean are doing this podcast and contributing, because we all contribute to the society that, makes those changes.
Absolutely. We mentioned AI, but I wanted to see if there were other vectors that you consider like more folks need to be paying attention to. I'm not sure if it's something like metaverse. I don't know if it's.
So I think Mark Zuckerberg is right. Augmented reality will be huge in the future. And the reason is, he probably doesn't say it like this, but like the way that your perception works right now is augmented reality. So you don't see the world as a direct readout of reality. What you see is much more useful than that. You see a controlled model of the world. So to give you an example, if I'm looking at your face now, Jocelyn, I'm looking at your nose, and you're in the middle of my screen, it looks like there is nice colours either side. My office walls are green and I can see them to the side of my vision. But it's not true that I'm actually receiving information about the walls of my office coming in and just coming up to like some passive TV set on my brain. Or I'm actually, because my retina doesn't have the types of receptors for seeing things other than light and dark, essentially all around the periphery, only have a color vision right in the very center. And so I'm seeing a model of the world in which the walls of this office are green. So he is right. Zuckerberg is right. AR, augmented reality will be a big thing because that's a natural extension of how our brain systems work anyway. In terms of the other big thing, so people like, and I was writing this before, talking about this before Wang, whatever, jumped on the bandwagon. Because he's not a man who can spot trends, that guy, the NVIDIA guy.
Yeah.
But is, robots. So I think robots are absolutely central. So if you think about why do we have the big leaps in AI in 2012 and then again in about 2022, 2012 with ImageNet and then 2022 with ChatGPT, it was basically about some advances in algorithms, but not massive ones, but some good, important ones, some massively increased compute power. And then the third thing was a huge new data set. And so one of the things is about robots. I think that the next big leap for me in AI is going to be through robots, because when you're a robot, you are embodied. You have a body, just like a human brain has a body. It doesn't really make any sense for your human brain to be like, you are in your body and you're constantly receiving vast amounts of information about the position of every joint in your body, auditory information, visual information. That's a huge amount of information. And I think that's where, ChatGPT basically used all of the information on the internet. There's nowhere further to go with that type of information. I think the next type of information we're going to get is from robots. And then I think once we start having embodied robots, they're going to become hugely more effective, and hopefully there will be a spiral where robots produce more data, that produces better robots, produce more data. And I also think that robots will, in some senses, be destined for conflict. So a robot that's working in a deep mine, for example, will have to have something akin to fear, right? Self-preservation. That will happen. And I can see no way of building robots that are embodied without building these types of things in. And then I think also we'll have to start thinking, because we're worried about super intelligence, not something I worry about as much as some other people, but, we do need to think about it. And how are we going to get robots to be aligned to our values as humans when we can't even agree what our values as humans are? If the three of us would probably have slightly different views on the values of what humans should want, right? What we want for humans.
Sure.
So how are we going to program that into what's called the objective function of an AI? I don't think we can really very effectively at all. And so instead, I think what we should do is we should be using what we know about the brain to build wiser AI. We're understanding so much more about how we can get wisdom. So that's seeing the bigger picture about ourselves in the world so that we can choose actions that help us achieve our goals. And, step back, reflect, ask if we're doing the right thing. Is this the right goal we want to achieve? And we can build that type of thing into AI. And I think that process of wiser AI, I think, is going to be hugely important. It's not going to be about specifying some outcome that we need the AI to achieve. It's going to be about building AI that is able to be wiser.
We want the nicer Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator, not the mean, scary one.
He's good. And he even knows that he has to kill himself at the end of, I don't want to ruin Terminator 2, even though it came out about 25 years ago, but
Exactly.
he's like, the little boy's like, don't kill yourself.
Nope,
and he's like, no, I'm
thumbs
going to
up.
have to, because otherwise the last chip is in my head. I haven't seen it for many years, but I believe, if I remember correctly, something.
Perfect rendition, sir.
Isn't that right?
Yeah. The thumb. Yeah.
He's going to destroy humanity. He's got to go.
Yeah. No, but he does. I mean, what a brave guy. Or android.
A wise AI.
Yeah, but he was, though. He was.
Very good.
Oh, he's a good guy. Yeah. I've never thought of that before, but I'm going to use that in future, so thank you. I'm going to steal that, and I'm going to use it.
Please, we
pretend I came up
didn't
with it all on
TM
my own.
it. It's, again, this is a working laboratory. Yeah, feel free to
No one's ever heard of that film Terminator,
exactly
anyway.
take your wares.
So with all this knowledge and, for those of us who can't even win a fight on Facebook with our uncles, what do we do how do we apply brain science to improve our lives in like everyday ways?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I could say there are so many ways in the book, but yeah, these are the this is the machinery with which we live our everyday lives. So, you talked about emotions. So how can we control our emotions better, harness them, use them better? So that, for example, is by, it became very unfashionable for a while to have a stiff upper lip, suppression, but suppression is actually a good way of getting over certainly short-term emotions. Reframing, we can reframe emotions. So, oh, I got those bad feedback from the interviewer because they were told to give me bad feedback. So reframing is another thing, reappraisal as it's called. And then a third way to think about how better control our emotions is to build up our reserves. So better sleep, exercise, nutrition, and so on. So, well, not nutrition really, but exercise and sleep.
Mm-hmm.
So, those are, for example, practical ways we can think about better controlling our emotions. Then if you think about things like, how can we make cleverer choices? What we do, we are really good at humans as thinking ahead through decision trees into the future, planning out into the future and coming up with plans. And so there are ways that there are really repeated ways that people will make mistakes, predictable ways people make mistakes, so we can anticipate those and try and avoid those. Like, for example, if there's a big negative thing early on that in a decision tree stretching out ahead of us that we don't like, then we often then ignore what happens beyond it, even though that might end up being better for us. So, for example, making an awkward telephone call to a boss or a spouse, even though that's actually something that, where the better outcomes lie behind that. Also creativity. So we need creativity to create our clever plans, to keep our plans on track. So how can we be more creative? And so, what's the actual science behind that? So it's things like, for example, it is true that sometimes the way to do it is and there are lots of studies that have looked at this, you carefully look at the problem, think of all the parts, you will then not be able to get the answer to the problem. You then go away and unload the dishwasher or take your cat for a walk or whatever it is that you want to do with a bit of time, and you get an aha moment. Equally, it's quite remarkable that the science of aha moments when you solve a problem creatively. And then, of course, as I said, then there's thinking beyond being clever, and that's to getting to being wise. Right, so beyond just being clever, like you're not, the chaps in the Big Bang Theory at Caltech, they're scientists, they're very clever guys, but they constantly get themselves in a mess because they don't see obvious context that will make their plan go completely awry. And we want to not be like that. We want to be a bit more like they were at the end of the series, where they suddenly realise that sometimes there's more. They see a bit more of the bigger picture, and we want to see a bit more of the bigger picture in our lives. And so there's things like, as I was talking about, we can create a better tapestry of knowledge, right? So we have better ignorance about some areas, better knowledge about other areas, and that helps us see the bigger picture and make wiser decisions. We can take third-person perspectives on challenges that we face. There are just lots and lots of practical ways that we can apply this brain science so that we can harness our emotions, so that we can learn better. For example, training. How can you train better? How can you train more effectively? Physical skills and other skills. How we can make cleverer decisions. And then how we can make wiser decisions, which is, an important part of our orchestra, the conductor of our orchestra. And we can enhance every part of our orchestra.
I want to throw in there, because now that I have a captive audience, trapped audience, one of my favorite tools is shitstorming, and I wanted to see what you think of this.
Oh, wow. Okay, I don't know about this. What's this?
I was told this is vulgar, but shitstorming is fun. It's fun to say. It's when you're talking about creativity and seeing another perspective. So it's like coming at a problem and coming, what is the absolute most ridiculous, stupidest idea, shittiest thing that you can come up with? And you start brainstorming those, and then you start selling those ideas, because once the idea behind this being you're free to think more flexibly because you're not worried about the quote unquote right answer.
Yes, I actually think that's a great idea. And if that now becomes a successful thing, everyone will go, not shitstorming again. That's so boring. Everyone does shitstorming. But it's a bit like, when you're in a meeting, and I'm sure you've both been in many meetings, and you're in a meeting and someone says, guys, I think we just need to step back for a moment and ask, what does success look like? And everyone's like, not that question. That's so boring. But actually, the thing is that you do need, sometimes you've gone through an hour and a half of a thing, and then you're like, no one really knows what we're trying to achieve here. What is the goal? What are we trying to achieve here? And so I think those types of things, they can sound cliched or whatever, but actually I think shitstorming is good. Stepping back and asking, what are we trying to achieve here? All of those things really can actually be useful.
You heard it here. getting it endorsed,
Did
putting it
you
on the website.
did you trademark the shitstorming thing, or did you invent
Should
it, or
trademark.
did you hear about this?
I've heard other people use it, and I just adopted the phrase. Sometimes it's called like "sell it to me" or other to me. I don't even remember them because they didn't stick the way that shitstorming sticks.
Yeah, exactly.
So-
Well, no, that's the thing, and being a good communicator is really important. It's like, using swear words helps. I mean, like my son, he would remember nothing about this podcast except that the nice lady used the word shit. It would stand out, and
wonderful.
ultimately, the child is the father of the man. So it's in there somewhere. Oh, in my brain, somewhere I'm saying to myself, "Oh, the nice lady used the word shit." So that's fun.
Nick, this has been a pleasure. Is there anything else you would like to give a shout out to, promote, and
No, I
direct
think
people to
it would
find
be.
you?
I'm really excited. I think you do a really, really important job. Trying to bring these like topics to a wider audience, and I'd love it if people read the book, and I would love
Please.
to have conversations about the book. If people want to contact me, I'm on Twitter and on LinkedIn and so on. I love engaging with these topics, and if I didn't, I wouldn't have written the book, and I would love to hear people's opinions.
Here. Go talk to him about Warhead, folks. Buy it now. Talk to him. Find him online. Thank you again so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I've come to talk with you again. Come and be inside my head. Cancel me, cancel me. I got things to say, you can cancel me. Cancel me, cancel me. I got things to say, you can cancel me. Cancel me, cancel me. I got things to say, you can cancel me. It's only a matter of time till we all win. Cancel the say. It's only a matter of time till we all win. Cancel the say. It's only a matter of time till we all win. Cancel the say. Cancel me. Cancel me. Cancel me. I got things to say. You can cancel me. Cancel me. Cancel me. I got things to say. You can cancel me. Cancel me. Cancel me. I got things to say. You can cancel me.